I will tell you that some of the most interesting feedback really comes around that career roadmap, and I think that's
Interesting.
one of my
Say a little bit
favorite
more about
things.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, going back to Schwab, when I first started doing that presentation, I started doing it to some larger audiences. I got
Really?
some feedback through my management channels that some people were taken aback by having a roadmap. And I thought to myself, why? Right? So I'm naming where I want to go. I'm saying
Sure.
here's our specific roles that I'd like to understand, that I think might be a good fit. I can't understand why that would be. And some people are like, well, it seems aggressive. And it was an interesting conversation to have, but I also think it's
Yeah.
one of the most powerful things that if you can put a piece of paper and say, here's where I am, and here's 5 or 6 potential roles that I think are my next step, and 5 or 6 potential roles that I think are the step after that, it totally changes the conversation. So some of it is again, you have to put yourself out there and be willing to say, no, this is good.
Hi, this is James Gray. Welcome to the podcast. In this episode, I speak with Ryan Reed. Ryan leads IT at JSR Corporation, and we have a wide-ranging conversation around topics of enterprise IT, the applications of artificial intelligence, and Ryan's journey to look inward and how that has navigated his career and how he's taken that foundation to the organization he leads around developing talent and encouraging and leading them to take ownership of their career and architect career roadmaps that lead them to the type of work that brings out their best in themselves and the impact of the organization. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Hi, this is James Gray, and welcome to the Gray Matter podcast. My guest today is Ryan Reed. Ryan leads IT at the JSR Corporation as part of the One Digital organization, which is responsible for helping to digitize JSR. In his current role, he has worldwide responsibility to work across all of JSR companies to establish a federated enterprise IT organization. In addition to working on a modernization strategy, Ryan has continued to lead and mentor employees on how to develop their career strategy. Prior to JSR, Ryan worked in financial services at Charles Schwab, where he spent time as the technology leader for the equity compensation business, as well as a software architect modernizing client communications. At Schwab, Ryan continued to refine his career strategy while also mentoring individuals and leading workshops for personal development based on the career strategy framework. Before Schwab, Ryan was with Microsoft in Denver and Redmond for 5 years. He held multiple roles during his tenure, including program manager, enterprise architect, and regional IT manager. In these roles, he primarily focused on creating a roadmap for modernization and migration to the cloud for Microsoft IT. Before joining Microsoft, Ryan was an IT director for Sandoz, a subsidiary of Novartis A.G., where he ran IT for manufacturing, regulatory, quality lab, and research teams. Ryan has a bachelor's degree in biochemistry from Colorado College and holds an MBA from the University of Colorado. Ryan Reed, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, James. Happy to be here. Excited about it.
Yeah, yeah, it's great to see you again. Obviously, we recently caught up and spent some time together back in the IT organization at Microsoft. And perhaps before we get into the conversation, you can share a little bit about the JSR Corporation, as well as where do you spend most of your time these days?
Sure. Yeah, so JSR is we are a chemical manufacturing company. We are based out of Japan, so headquartered in Tokyo, and we work across a number of different industries. But really, the underlying component of that is really through chemistry. And so we have areas where we make raw materials for semiconductor manufacturing through photoresist. We have a plastics business, and we also have a life sciences business, which is where I joined JSR. And so in our life sciences business, we do have a contract research organization helping with developing drugs. And then we have a contract development manufacturing organization, which is really where we start to scale up drug manufacturing for phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials, as well as commercial drug manufacturing. And then we also have a diagnostics business. So we have a one of the biggest in vitro diagnostics business in Japan, and we also that goes worldwide. So really a diverse set of companies, but
Yeah.
kind of the underlying is really just chemistry and using technology through chemistry to make the world a better place.
Yeah, no, that sounds really interesting, and I can imagine from an IT perspective, right? That's probably fairly challenging if you're in multiple locations, different geographies, different cultures.
It really is, and it's the company has grown up through both the organic growth as well as inorganic growth, and then focusing on those different industries has had different areas of focus from an IT perspective. So you said, well, where am I spending my time? And it's really trying to execute on a strategy of how to build out a federated IT organization. So historically JSR has worked in a lot of silos, so each company has kind of been running on its own. And we really recognize that if we want to unlock the power of data, so as we have all these companies doing different things through chemistry, we have a lot of data that we're generating, but in order to be able to unlock that, we also realize that we have to have an environment that allows people to work across all of those different data silos as well as company silos. And so in my role, what I'm trying to do is really help create a federated IT environment. So what are the core areas of IT that should be more centralized, should be more consistent across the companies? And what are those areas of IT that still should remain with the subsidiary companies and allowing those companies to focus on differentiated technology or differentiated applications? And so that's really where I'm spending that time is trying to figure out, well, how do we, now that we have this strategy, how do we kind of put it together? How do we really help show the different areas, the different business units? Here's the value that we're going to bring by doing this model. How do you give up a little bit of control of IT in order to gain more value?
No, that's really interesting. And I know when we were at Microsoft, right, it was kind of a somewhat of a similar strategy. And it sounds like at JSR, it sounds like data is really a key enabler for, as you said, kind of unlocking this kind of power through chemistry. I'm just curious, like over maybe the last year or two, what have been some either projects or new capabilities that you found helpful for kind of accelerating your strategy?
So as part of our overall digitization effort, we've really had this roadmap that says we know that we need to aggregate the data. And then once we can start to aggregate that data, we have multiple tools that we can use to unlock that aggregated data. So we've really been building out a platform on AWS. We've been
Hmm.
leveraging a lot of the AWS tools that natively are available. So how do we think about creating a data lake, and how do we apply that data to the data lake? How do we also think about how do we uh, add more to the data? How do we create the metadata, right? That we can understand when the data is coming in from multiple different disparate sources, and the companies might have different ways that they've named that data. How do we actually bring it all together and make sense of it? And so that's been one project that's really been undergoing for about the past 3 years. But what we're really starting to see is we're really starting to see the fruits of our labor. So we have more and more systems that are actually feeding data into our data lake. And now with that, we're going to be able to start using machine learning to start unlocking some of those insights to that data. So we've been really focusing on, we want to get to the point where we have a aggregated set of data where we can then use things like machine learning to be able to create insights and then use dashboards that we can empower users to also create their own insights using kind of self-serve dashboards.
Yeah, that sounds great. And I know, having worked with you at Microsoft, I know certainly one of your strengths is right around architecture, around enterprise IT, and as you described, kind of balancing what do you do centrally from right a centralized IT perspective to kind of have those standards that really get used and applied across the organization while enabling right the some things to kind of really happen on the edge, right? Enabling
Yeah,
agility for those businesses. And I know that's always like a little bit of tension there. But as you
yeah,
said, to be able to get and derive some of the value, there needs to be right some centralization to the effort.
yeah, totally. Yeah, we're looking at really some of those. for lack of a better term, commodity things that every company must do, right? So every company must run a network. Every company must have security. All those, the basic IT operations, whether you're running a compute workload on-prem or whether you're running that workload in the cloud, those things every company needs to do, and they're critical, right? The
Right.
expectation of every company today is that those things just work. They work seamlessly. No one has to think about it. Those are the things we're going after to really say if we can connect those across the corporation in a consistent way, not only are we going to help those businesses just kind of run it, forget it, we can start talking about the economy of scale, but then also we start to unlock vehicles for us to be able to aggregate even more data. So where we might have data that's sitting on a file share on a server, in Belgium, now all of a sudden if we start to connect that infrastructure, that data is no longer isolated to that file share in Belgium, but really could be accessible by someone in Japan or China, depending on what the case may be. So that's really what we're trying to
Sure.
enable.
Sure. And, I know you mentioned machine learning. Have there been any kind of recent ideas around how to leverage any of these kind of latest AI technology to enable your business in
Yes.
some way?
Yes, we've been looking at a lot of different things. And so I think, generative AI, conversational AI, all of these large language models, they're awesome. I love the technology. I love understanding more about it. And I do think that it's really going to have power to transform business. I think that as we look back in about 3 years, it's going to be amazing what we see. But right now, what I'm seeing in the market is a lot of theoretical things. So it's a lot of marketing saying, "Hey, we've got this tool that's using this large language model," and then you say, "Okay, great, yep, sign me up. I want to do a proof of concept." And they're like, "Well, we're not ready yet. It's
Hmm.
coming. It's not fully developed yet. We don't have access to it yet, or it's we're going to have access, but it's cost prohibitive right now." So what I'm seeing right now is a lot of potential. So you see a ton of
Sure.
potential, but there's not as many opportunities to actually do some implementation. The closest thing that I've found right now is we're having some really interesting conversations with a couple companies around conversational AI and really kind of how do you work with the service desk, and can you
Sure.
use conversational AI in that type of model that's more than just a, if you will, traditional service desk chatbot. It goes beyond that. So that's one area that we're seeing. But other than that, what I'm seeing is that many of the tools that are out there that you could use today also require a lot of internal development. So at that point, it doesn't look that much different than doing your own set of custom development and using an AI tool or a machine learning tool in a platform like AWS or Azure.
Nice. Sure. Sure. And, from my perspective, right, I think you'd probably agree, right? A lot of this new value is going to come through not only, right, the ability to bring your own data, right, to bear with these large language models is really, I think, really the key there, right, to make it really applicable to your business and very domain specific and leveraging that. And I know, as you just said, that's been a major focus around getting a lot of this data infrastructure right so that you're in a position, right, when the time is right around leveraging some of these emerging technologies.
Yeah, that's the key, right? I mean, it's how can I use this tool across all of my different disparate data sets internally, and how could I start unlocking those insights? I mean, in a lot of ways, that's the platform that we've been trying to build, and we've been building in AWS. But in some ways, depending on what the tool is, could really help accelerate and unlock those insights of data that we may not even be thinking about. So data that's just sitting there that we may not have that ability.
Sure.
Conversely, though, that's also the scary part of it, right? Because you talk about so many of those large language models, and they're like, "Oh yeah, we just ingest all your data, we put it in the model." And they're like, "Wait, no, those are company secrets. You
Yeah.
can't have those. You've got to isolate those." So how do you apply the data set and train that data set with a large language model, but not expose your company data to everyone else who might be using the tool? Again, I've seen some
Sure.
interesting conversations around what they're doing to anonymize the data and those types of things. Still, the devil's in the details, right? Of
Sure.
okay, do we really feel comfortable with exposing all of that data to that model or not?
Sure. And as you said, the use case that you just described around service desk, right? I think that's kind of low hanging fruit, right? There's been
Yeah.
technologies around that, right? And being able to support, right, all the internal employees inside a company and be able to, right, save them time, leverage your organization, right, so that the folks in your IT team are spending time on the most, kind of L3 type
Yeah.
problems. I think that's a low hanging use case.
Exactly. I mean, and even on the service desk, a lot of people think that that's, oh, you're basically outsourcing service desk. It's like, no, we have so many things we can be doing to make that
Sure.
employee experience better, that digital experience better. And it's the people who actually understand what are the problems that we're encountering, whether it's people in the office or it's people that are remote. What are those things that we maybe just haven't had time to go fix because
Two.
we're just responding to tactical stuff all the time? And so really it's kind of up leveling, allowing people to focus on the things that add more value as opposed to necessarily saying, oh, we're just cutting costs by outsourcing something to, an AI system.
Technology. Sure. Sure. And you said you run on AWS, or it sounds like it's only one cloud you run on AWS?
We no, we are multi-cloud. So we
Multi
are on
cloud.
AWS. We're on Azure. A lot of our development's been done in AWS based off of some of the tools that they've continued to deploy, as well as some of the skill set of some of our development team. But our intent is fully to be cloud agnostic as much as possible, and you really leverage whatever cloud makes sense.
Sure.
So we certainly still see we see that Azure's really, they've got some advantages, obviously, especially in the Office 365 space, that overall employee experience. But we see that, Google still has some really good stuff as far as when you get to really big data sets and you really want to start to apply some of that stuff. Google's cloud is really interesting as well. So, yeah, really, we're not trying to lock ourselves down to any one cloud. We want our data to be portable as much as possible, and we want those workloads to go to whatever cloud makes sense.
Yeah, and that's been my experience as a CIO as well. And right, a lot of times through acquisition, you don't get a choice, right?
Yeah.
Where you're going to be, in many cases, hybrid cloud, right, through kind of acquisition or certain regions, certain capabilities. And I think your strategy of right leveraging the platforms who have certain capabilities that meet the use case, I think that's really spot on.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, and you also mentioned right this idea that right you've got all these different applications inside the company, right, and employees just expect those to be a dial tone, right? That
Yeah.
throughout the whole kind of operations, whether it's office locations or manufacturing locations, right? That's a huge responsibility for right a leader like you to oversee and ensure all of that gear and all those kind of capabilities kind of work seamlessly. Any thoughts or feedback on that as well?
Yeah, it's as we think about kind of what that digital employee experience is, it's getting more and more important. As we think about a younger workforce coming in, we have what's the digital natives, right? They're showing
Sure.
up and they've always had an iPhone. Their first device is typically an iPhone or something like that, a smartphone. And so they expect to be able to do anything anywhere. And to your point, they're not used to being able to say, well, that's only an on-prem application that you have to go through a VPN to access. That's not how they want to work. And that's not how you're going to be able to have a highly engaged workforce. So those are certainly things we're thinking about, which is what is it that we're doing to make sure that we remove those barriers, that we can give the people the accessibility to do the work that they need to do wherever they need to do it. Yet at the same time, obviously keeping security at the edge is first and foremost. And so some of it is some cases we need to upgrade applications. Some cases we are looking at more SaaS applications versus
Sure.
on-prem applications. In other cases, what we're also starting to see a little bit now is more and more is maybe starting to break apart some of these big
Mhm.
monolithic applications and using more point solutions. And so as we can think about if I can aggregate data from point solutions, then I don't really need these big monolithic applications to do everything. And so
Sure.
that's an interesting trend that we're starting to kind of see more and more is that well, I don't need just one application to do my HRIS. I could use 4 or 5 different applications and aggregate the data in the back end. From a user experience perspective, maybe as long as I keep that seamless, and then as a data perspective, keep it seamless, then I can really enable some potential different opportunities as opposed to these big, huge projects to do upgrades or to add new features. So that's certainly
Yeah.
something we're seeing more and more of.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting strategy, and I know, right, from your Microsoft days, you have lots of experience, right, from an architecture standpoint. And when I think about agility as well, right, having been a CIO, right, as you said, you can't afford these long, costly, big, right. You need to be able
Yeah,
to innovate. You need to be able to innovate on the edge. And as you
yeah.
said, right, there's all these new capabilities that allow you to do some of the heavy lifting from the data perspective on the back end that allow you to, in some cases, choose a best of breed approach.
Yeah, totally. Especially with so many companies really trying to adopt Agile. So when you think about Agile in the sense of traditional software development, very easy. But if you try to apply Agile to some big project, let's just say you're doing an SAP upgrade, all of a sudden that becomes really, really hard to try to get this Agile mindset. And you can do it for sure. But when you want to say, well, I want to do, one specific area, I want to move faster, or I want to move at a different pace than the rest of say, a big upgrade, it makes it really hard. And so
Sure.
now if you can start to break some of these things apart that say, it becomes a little bit more and more like the microservices architecture. So, as we were talking about, 8 years ago, 10 years ago, right? It's how do you think about microservices and all these interactive services where you have a common data layer and you might have a common user experience, but in between you have a set of services that can do different workloads. That's what we're starting to see a little bit more with applications, because now we can also start to think about agile implementation and agile
Mm.
iteration on applications as opposed to what we've done traditionally.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. No, I think that it totally makes sense, right, to take that kind of approach and have, right, some decoupling of those capabilities that allow you to innovate
Yeah.
those, point solutions kind of over time. Um, Yeah, so what I'd like to do is perhaps just transition a little bit from the technology side, which I know we love, right? We love technology, but I'd like to transition a bit to talk about some things related to, right? How do we, as leaders, as technology leaders, right, develop ourselves, but also develop, right, the talent in our organizations, and what have been some of the experiences that you've done throughout your career to kind of really do that well, in a really good example. And so I'd like to take us back to almost 10 years ago, right, where you were one of the first people to join, a workshop that I had this real curiosity to go explore, right, this framework around, right, how do we, right, at that time inside of Microsoft, really take ownership of our career, get in touch with that, look inside, and then be in a better position, right, to be clear about where we're going, being able to engage people in our story. And so I'm just curious, right? The first part of that workshop was really taking this pause to look inside, right, and do some
Yeah.
introspection. I'm just curious. Tell me a little bit about what that felt like, and what were some of the things that you learned from that workshop or that experience.
Yeah. So for me, when I was in Microsoft, the timing of this was so perfect. So I'd been at Microsoft, I think maybe a couple of years at that point, and was really trying to figure out where did I fit. So really enjoyed being at Microsoft, but it is a very dynamic place with a bunch of different things going on, and I was really trying to figure out where I fit. And so when you came and said, "Hey, here's this process that we're going to go through," it was a great timing for me because it was directly aligned with what I was interested in. But that first step of trying to figure out like who I am and why, it was both interesting and really challenging. So I'd always had kind of career goals, but they've been kind of maybe 1 or 2 career goals, very high level, and then oftentimes many years in the future without really much detail around it. And so for me, this trying to slow down and figure out what's important to me outside of the context of yearly objectives was the first time that I'd ever done that. So before it was always, okay, this is my job role, this is the objectives, and if I exceed on the objectives and I get to the next job role, great, I've made progress, right?
Sure.
And in theory, if I keep taking those steps, then I make enough progress to get to that longer term goal. But I'd never really thought about it holistically. And at the time, I'd also been approaching very much having this concept of a work life and a private life completely separate. And this really kind of said, you have to break down the barriers because you spend so much time at work and you spend so much of your person and your effort in work, and that also comes home with you.
Sure.
There's really no way to keep those two things separate. And so, like I said, so I remember one of the first weekends trying to say, okay, I'm going to do this, right? I'm going to do this homework of figuring out what is my purpose, what is my why. And I couldn't. I was like, I can't think this way. And so trying to actually slow down and say, all right, independent of Ryan working at Microsoft, what's important? Like, what do I want to do? Why am I doing it? And what is it, that this job is doing? What's interesting in the job, but what's interesting for me as a person? So it was definitely a first to step back and really think about myself in that way from a career perspective. Like I had done some of that maybe from a personal perspective, but I'd never done that in a career context and then bringing that personal and professional life together.
Sure. And I heard other feedback from other people as well, like James, that was really hard in some cases, very emotional, sometimes very introspective, or having to really kind of look inside. Having kind of gone through that, and I know I'd love to hear a little bit about what you continue to do. That might be some techniques and habits around how do you keep yourself kind of grounded. But what would you say some of the kind of influences or impacts or results of kind of doing that, getting to that why, getting to that purpose?
So, yeah, maybe lots to unpack there. So it was, like I said, for me, one of the big things was kind of breaking down some of those barriers. I think maybe today, 10 years later, maybe it's not as much that people have those barriers because we are so interconnected now. But that is, I think, one of the bigger things was to do that, and then also really have the confidence to talk about that. That was maybe one of the more interesting things is, okay, it's like, we spent this time, we developed this stuff. And then I remember you're like, okay, now you have to go talk to your boss about it. And, thinking about, oh man, this is, I don't talk to my boss about these things, right?
Yeah.
I talk to my boss about, here's where I am on my projects. Here's what I'm doing, those types of things. And in this case, now you have some really personal things, but so I remember going through, and luckily I was it was great to have some really good managers while I was at Microsoft who were very encouraging and open to these conversations, and had those conversations, and really was powerful. Really changed the dynamic of the conversation from just okay, here's work, but really kind of who you are as a person and being able to bring myself as a person to work. And so that's one of the big things I think is so one of the ways that I continue to do that is when I have a new manager, or in a lot of cases also when I meet with some other leaders that I'm going to be maybe working with in a very tight perspective over a longer period of time, I'll walk through parts of the career strategy with them, and I'll talk to them a little bit about what is my why, how did I get to where I am, and what is some of my why. So again, so they have a little bit of context about who I am and potentially how I'm going to approach some of the things that we're working together. So that would be one of the areas that I've really seen is that helps drive it. The other thing it helps is really for me revisiting to kind of say, is this still aligned? Are the things that I put down still aligned, or has life changed enough that maybe I'm transitioning into a different phase and maybe some of these things need to be updated?
No, that makes sense. Thanks for sharing that. And I think this is another reminder, right, for all of us that, what I saw certainly during my times at Microsoft, a lot of people thought that they didn't have agency. I'd hear, oh, James, like there's all these reorgs going on, da, 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 da. And I would say, you need to right? You're in a seven, you need to kind of put that sail up, right? And set direction and really engage other people in your cause. Otherwise, in these large corporations, right, you're just going to get lost, right? And so
Totally.
I encourage people that you need to take ownership, right, and do some of the things you just described, which is you have to, right, engage other people in your cause, right? As you said the example,
Totally.
right? You take people through, hey, here's Ryan Reed. Let me take you through these things. And I also would use that during my times during a skip level. And this, people may want to do this. What I would do is I would send those like 5 slides or whatever. This is me. This is who I am. These are my strengths. This is kind of my roadmap. This is where I'm going. This is my development. That's me on paper. And I remember meeting a skip level, right, new organization, and I sent him my deck, I don't know, a number of days before the one-on-one. And he's like, that was awesome, because we would have spent the first, half hour of the conversation around, well, who are you? And like, he said, that changed it, because now we can talk about, your place in the organization. How can we help? And to your point, it completely changes the organization, because you're very thoughtful about who you are and where you're going and how that 1 + 1 = 3.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, and I think that concept of agency and really getting people on your side is critical. And whether that's either your manager or your skip level, but also any mentors that you might have across the organization, or even especially in an organization like Microsoft that has kind of formal mentoring programs. As you're trying to find those mentors, it's a really good thing that you can find those people who can be advocates for you. I will tell you that I used it really a lot when I was at Schwab, especially when I first joined Schwab. So, I hadn't worked in financial services before. Schwab was, in multiple different, states and cities at the time, and leaders were kind of spread all over. And so I really used the same concept so that I could go meet with some key leaders at Schwab and not only do that introduction of, hey, here's who I am, and here's some of the things I'm interested in, where I want to go. But again, as you said, it really helped accelerate the conversation to now they had an understanding of who I was. And I found that not only were they open to being advocates, but they were also more open in the conversation about themselves. And so we tended not to have that just surface level conversation that you might get with that first 30-minute meeting, or maybe only 30-minute meeting with a mentor potential, right? Now all of a sudden you're having a deep conversation around that. I'll tell you another example is I was interviewing for a role, and it was kind of one level up with a VP that I hadn't worked for. So I sent her my deck, right? So I sent her my deck before the interview, and I just said, hey, I know you've seen my resume, but I just wanted to share some of these things about me. And we actually spent the whole interview talking about the deck. And she was asking me questions about what is my, she was more interested in those types of things. She's like, well, tell me more about this, and let's talk about this, right? As opposed to really talking about the job and trying to interview on the skill set. We talked really about, who I was and where I wanted to go. And so it was a very interesting interview. I unfortunately didn't get the job, but it was a, it all worked out, but it was a really interesting conversation.
No, that's a really interesting example. And so what did it look like? As you said, you sent her the deck in advance, it sounds like, and she got a chance to kind of digest that a bit. And to your point, totally changed kind of the conversation. And I too have found when you can really concisely make it easy for people to understand, right? They're in a much better position to help an advocate for you, right? I think the thing is, we got to remember, right, as people who are managing their own career as well as leaders, right, is that they're not mind readers, right? They are not mind readers. So you can't expect them to take responsibility around, shaping your path. They're there certainly to support. But when you can tell a really interesting story about who you are and where you're going and the great and wonderful things that you want to do, 99 times out of 100 people will just jump on the bandwagon to help you however they can.
Yeah. I will tell you that some of the most interesting feedback really comes around that career roadmap. And I think that's one of my favorite
Say a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So again, going back to Schwab, when I first started doing that presentation, I started doing it to some larger audiences. I got
Really?
some feedback through my management channels that some people were taken aback by having a roadmap. And I thought to myself, why? Right? So I'm naming where I want to go. I'm saying
Sure.
here's our specific roles that I'd like to understand, that I think might be a good fit. I can't understand why that would be. And some people are like, well, it seems aggressive. And it was an interesting conversation to have, but I also think it's
Yeah.
one of the most powerful things that if you can put a piece of paper and say, here's where I am, and here's 5 or 6 potential roles that I think are my next step, and 5 or 6 potential roles that I think are the step after that, it totally changes the conversation. So some of it is again, you have to put yourself out there and be willing to say, no, this is good. I'm not saying that you have to go promote me right now. I'm saying this
Right.
is where I want to work towards. And again, there were some people who kind of bristled about saying, well, don't you seem like you're aggressive? And I don't think so. Right. Again, going back to I have
Yeah.
agency over where I want to go. I'm not waiting for someone else in the company to tell me where I want to go. And then ultimately it was then with a mentor relationship, a couple mentor relationships at Schwab, having that same conversation on that same roadmap that ultimately got me to the next step in my roadmap. And had I not had that, had I not named, this is the position that I think I want to go in, and had conversations around that position, I wouldn't have been, potentially I wouldn't have been in consideration for some of those. But because of that, I had a lot more people coming to me who said, hey, I have a job that looks like the thing that you want. Are you interested in having a conversation? So it started out a little bit. People were like, yeah, I don't know. That's kind of, seems pushy. And
Interesting.
really ended up being, okay, it's not being pushy. And oh, by the way, here, we're going to help you get to where you want to go.
Well, and I think that's just it, right? I think one, we got to remember we are responsible for our life and our career. Like, no, like the cavalry is not coming to help us, would be kind of one perspective. And I think, just for a little bit of context, what Ryan's talking about is just a, kind of as IT and as product people, right? Just that roadmap of what does it look like through time. And I think that's kind of the visual piece, right? And I think this is another thing that's really powerful when you can show someone a very simple visual about kind of where you are and what might be potential pathways. You don't really know, right? But you're opening up the conversation around, right, some potential pathways to make them conscious and talk to people who might be along that path and get some feedback, whether that's doing an interview, right, a mock type interview or perspective, to get from someone who might be independent, and then getting some feedback around, hey, am I even qualified? And for
Yeah.
me to even get that job, I did that at Microsoft, right? I'd go for these informationals and say, hey, I love your team, I love your org, but tell me, like, what is the friction? What would I need to do to really overcome that? And knowing that in advance and having people really help you objectively, give you some guidance and some feedback. And so thanks for sharing that example around having a roadmap. I think for us who are builders, right, it just becomes naturally, right? We spend
Yeah.
so much time in our careers in the technology field, like building roadmaps for our products,
Yeah.
right? And capabilities. It's no different than doing from ourselves. But a lot of times people don't get around to it and they really miss that opportunity around bringing and engaging other people in that story.
Yeah. And one thing I just want to pick up on that you mentioned is that kind of that what could the next job be look like. So one of the things I do when I'm working with people on their career strategy, is I challenge them that as they think about a roadmap or as they think about what's next, is either go find that job inside the company you're working for, or go jump on Indeed or something like that and go find a job description for some other company that's kind of has that title, and look through it, and really look through and say, well, what are the things that I think I have? What are the things that I don't have? And is there opportunities within my current role to go get experiences around
Yeah.
that to help me build up towards that? But I have my personal one of the things I did, it was both at Microsoft and then again as when I was at Schwab, was, yeah, I went out and I got job descriptions, and I saved the job description and I put it in my folder right next to my career strategy. And I looked at what are the details, what are the skill sets, what are the opportunities that I need to go after as part of my development plan in
Sure.
order to do that. So another, I think, really valuable tool of thinking about where you want to go. But it goes back to you have to kind of slow down enough to think about where you want to
Sure.
go before you can get to some of those
Yeah.
actions.
Yeah. And I love the example that you just gave, right? A lot of times too, we don't think we have agency in our current job, right, to get more of what we do. And I had used that with one of my directs at Microsoft, where she wanted to have more experience in something. Like she just said, like, I want more experience in that. Well, we kind of reshaped her role, right, for her to get that, because without that, it was really going to be tough for her to do, right, more impactful work inside my org, as well as be able to kind of move on, right, to kind of the next thing.
Sure.
Yeah. So thanks for really sharing that that example. And to your point, just like you have to be conscious enough, right? And
Yeah.
we're in organizations that change all the time, right? And I remember one reorg going on at Microsoft. I was at the Pro Club running and thinking about this, and I've been in my role for, I don't know, 5 or so years, and my team was great, really didn't need me. And like, James, we have the reorg, we want to continue to just take your team and stuff like that. And I'm like, and as I thought about it, and what I did, very similar to you, I took my deck, sent it to the leader, and I had already been reassigned to this leader. And I said, you know what? Here's my strategy. Get me closest to that as possible.
Yeah.
And I actually, before the thing was finalized, they moved me to a different team. And even the manager who I was supposed to go to work for, he's like, James, that's totally cool. Like, do it for you. Totally understand. Yeah. And so that's another piece, right? It doesn't become this goofy thing, right? You're trying to put yourself in the place in the organization to do the most impactful work, doing the work, right? And it's not rocket science, but again, people need to hear the story to be able to assist you, right, in that capacity.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, it's a really good point, because I think that, so as a leader, right, I want the person to be in the right position to be successful. And if they can help define what that looks like for them, I understand the business goals. I spend a lot of time on understanding strategy and scorecards and KPIs and all those types of things. And I know that I have a set of resources, both internal and external, that I can use to go help me achieve those goals. But ultimately, I want someone who's excited about what they're going to do, because they're going to put more time and effort and passion into that thing. And
Sure.
and if I'm just shoving someone into a role and asking them to do things that's really not aligned to where they want to go, that not only are they not going to necessarily do a great job, but they're probably not going to be there long, right? Either they're going to start saying, hey, I need a different job, I need a different team, I'm going to be looking outside the company. And so that's another thing that I've really found now as a leader who's helping to talk to people about this, is that it's so important. I want those people on my team who are really excited about doing those things. And if they're not, I'd also like to be the leader who says, if this isn't a great fit, let's find you a good fit.
Sure.
Because I'd rather bring in someone who's going to be a good fit.
No, I love that example. And actually, I was going to kind of go there right next, is that that when we make these conversations more transparent, more trusting, more open, right, it becomes this really uncomfortable thing to actually a very empowering thing. To your point, and I know I've had those conversations, right? I remember even at Microsoft, right? Oh, do I tell my manager I'm actually looking inside? Like, that was a big no-no.
Yeah.
For my team was like, hey, I want to be your biggest advocate, right? If you want to go interview, and I know they changed the rules and stuff, but at that time it was like this, people felt like they needed to be hushed, but I wanted to be like the best advocate for people in my team. And then to your point, if there's not a fit there, then let's just kind of together, right, manage the transition so that, right, as a leader, you have a business to manage and continuity, and then you want somebody to really have a good offboarding and runway to go make that transition. So I think it can totally change the experience, right, for the person as well as the manager, because they're very caring in the way they go about that. and having this open and transparent. And when it's about the person, right, then I
Yeah.
think it becomes something that's genuine.
Yeah, and I think that that's talk. Yeah, I mean, being open is a lot of times can be really scary, right? That there's now this really it's just a different conversation, and so many times I feel like employees can be very guarded because they're just like,
Sure.
okay, I met my objectives, I can keep my job, and now you're going to come in and say, well, I want to change things. And some of it depends on the company, and some of it depends on the culture of the company. Some of it depends on your manager. I've had a manager again back now when I was at Schwab, who was, as we were having some of these conversations, like just started openly talking about, well, what's the next job? Is it internal to Schwab or is it not? How can I connect to you?
Mm.
And it was really very freeing to be able to then have this conversation of talking to a manager like, hey, I saw this job and I think I'm going to go apply, and just have a conversation about it. Again, that the dynamic just changes. But if you don't start with something to talk about you and open the door, you can't have those conversations. So it may be that you start to open the door, and you kind of put yourself out there a little bit, and it's
Yeah.
not received well. Okay, then you kind of understand that. Maybe that influences what's next.
Yeah. No. Yeah, for sure.
So I certainly have seen that taking that step and opening yourself up a little bit more, being a little bit more authentic is yeah, it's scary, but it's also really freeing as far as where it
Yeah.
can take you.
Yeah, I think you make a good, like, there needs to be this almost kind of catalyst for trust and for this openness.
Yeah,
And certainly as a leader, you need to create that, but the person needs to actually, right? And obviously as a leader, you need to kind of help create that environment that, kind of makes that certainly happen. But you have to be willing to say, this is who I am. And to your point, also bring all of you, certainly what I encouraged at Microsoft, right? Like, you're like, bring all of you who you are, right? Bring that uniqueness, bring all those things about who you are so that people have a really great idea how you can best be leveraged.
and I think that's so. I think that's a critical point. So there's especially in today's culture, it's sometimes hard to bring all of you to work, right? You might be afraid of what people think about you for a political belief or religious belief or whatever the case may be.
Sure.
I really find the career strategy is an awesome way that you can just kind of open yourself up in a if you will, non-threatening, non-aggressive way. You can just say, "Hey, this is who I am," and you're having it in a conversation that's not specifically in a political context or an HR context, right? It's now this is who I am, and you can just open that conversation. And I've found that really does allow it to open a conversation about who you are, what you believe, without necessarily being, again, an aggressive way maybe
Sure.
of doing that, or just burying it and saying, well, I don't feel like I have an opportunity to speak about who I am at this workplace because they don't believe the same thing I do.
That's an interesting perspective. And, there's different cultures, obviously. And one of the things that I heard from people actually in the workshop that you were at was, hey, James, I'm really introverted. I don't feel comfortable going in front of people, kind of telling them who I am and where I'm going. And so, part of it is like, one, you need to be able to tell your story. It doesn't mean it's in front of 1,000 people, but at least it
Yeah,
needs to be like with your manager and other caring people who are in your
right.
circle so that you gain a little bit of practice in a safe space. And what I saw every time I saw someone get in front of people, let's say 15 minutes and tell their story, the thing that I saw energy, I saw
Yeah,
pride, I saw
yeah.
excitement. I saw like, just this is who and me, even if it's like, as you said, really, really interesting things that you have that you just didn't even know about a person. So I think thanks for really kind of sharing that perspective. Um, and so I'm kind of curious. Let's say I just joined your org in IT. I know you take out time to coach, mentor people. What does that look like if I'm
Yeah.
in your org? And yeah, what does it look like?
So what I typically do is whether it's a new person to my organization or new peer or new leaders is I really try to set up about 45 minutes and I walk them through my career strategy. And I do that not so much so that they can say, hey, I want to do this, but as much as, again, just to show kind of who I am. And I'll tailor it to the audience, right? So I might remove some slides, I might keep some slides in, depending on what it is. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll even just do kind of, my who I am and my career, kind of how did I get there, so people have kind of that background. I start there, and then I always kind of close it with just saying, inviting them is, if this is something that you think is interesting, if you'd like to develop your career, if you'd like to talk more about this, yeah, please set up time. Give it back to them and just say, hey, my calendar's open. Set up 30 minutes. We can talk about this. I could talk you through about what it would look like to set that up. When people do that, right? So they have to want to do that. But when they do that, then really what I suggest is kind of a 6-month program where we connect on a monthly basis in person, and we talk through kind of how they're developing their own career strategy. But in the interim, I also do kind of every 2 weeks, I'll just do a check-in. Hey, how are things going? Have you made progress? In a lot of cases, remind them, because everyone gets busy. And remember, it's kind of hard to actually sit down, slow down, and take the time to think about it. And so I think sometimes people think, oh, I'll just do that, whenever. You get to it and it's like, oh, this is a lot harder than I thought. I don't want to actually set aside the time. And so you have to have kind of that accountability ongoing. And once we kind of get through that first, define your why and your purpose, at that point people are like, oh, I get it. And they really start to get the ball rolling themselves, and we were able to do that. But I typically take about 6 months on a kind of a one-on-one basis with a kind of a 30-minute check-in once a month.
Once a month. Okay. That's interesting. And what I love about that example is just that, is you're leading by example, right? And so I can imagine that just really kind of, wow, like my leader's actually telling me who he is and how he got here and what his story looks like. And I would imagine they see that is really an invitation to do that themselves.
Yeah, I hope so. That's always the intent.
Yeah.
You've got to be a little bit vulnerable and say that this is not just, this is leading by example. And, really,
yeah.
I do, make sure that I include some of these things about how did I get to different positions, and how did I use my career strategy to make these decisions. And so that's been a pretty typical routine. I have had some people that I've presented this. I had one woman in particular that I presented this. She was a new grad. She'd been with the company for about a year. I presented my career strategy to a larger group as part of an overall development process that we were working on. And she set up a meeting with me like the next day, and she'd already done her whole strategy by the next day. So she was really fired up. It was kind of cool to see. She actually did. She put a lot of thought into it. It was really good. But it was, for the most part, it takes a little while for people to go on the journey.
Well, and so I just wanted to second that, right? It's kind of a journey. It's not like something you do in an hour, right? And it does take, right, some quiet time, whether you want to go take a walk, whether you want to, do it really on a weekend. And there's some activation energy, right? Like, where do I start? Yeah. And what you just mentioned about the one story about this one young woman reminds me of somebody at Microsoft who did the same thing. He saw me speak at one workshop that I was at, did not talk to him. He came to me like on Monday after the weekend and say, hey, James, like I went to your thing and like, here's my deck. And I was really blown away that within a very short time, he put together his story. And the cool thing about it was, actually, it reminds me, he actually did it with his wife. Which is the first time I ever heard from someone who actually, kind of like, no, my wife and I, now she worked at Microsoft as well. And she was actually the person who invited me to speak at the workshop. So maybe it was a little bit of, the priority, but they did it together. And I thought that was so cool, right? Because like we're on this journey, certainly of our career, but we don't, right? Many of us who have partners and spouses, right? We're taking this journey together and ensuring that there's alignment around who we are and where we're going and what we need for this to be a great relationship and a great career, right? Where we spend lots of our time. I think was an interesting example.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, good. So, any kind of final kind of thoughts around, right, as you think about, again, whether it's your own kind of development or anything else that you'd maybe tell leaders who are maybe have never done this, right? Because it's not commonplace.
Yeah.
Like any kind of final things that you would kind of share with them?
Yeah, I would really encourage everyone, whether you do the whole thing or not, to pause and really kind of figure out your why. Why are you going to work? What are you doing beyond getting a paycheck and having a title? What is it that you're trying to do as part of your broader life? Right. So there's kind of this, what is my life purpose? But there's this whole period of time in your career and you have a bunch of stuff going on, but why are you doing it? And if you can put aside the time, take that energy, as you said, I think, something like taking a walk or get away from the electronics, think about it, don't
Yeah.
have any input except just kind of your own thoughts, and put some of it down on paper. And
Yeah.
and I know, James, you have resources that people can reference, and I really would take some time to read some of those references and read through some of those types of things, and then just go think about it for a while. And I personally like going on a walk and thinking about things. I definitely feel like it takes a little while for my brain to kind of disconnect from the emails and all
Yeah.
those other things. And so going for a walk is a great way to do it. But really encourage everyone to really think about that. I'd also encourage you to have your team think about it. So have a development conversation that's just not in the context of objectives. Like, whether you're great with objectives and you're checking in with your team every quarter and doing all those things, that's still kind of a 1 year thing that's associated with a company goal. And you might have something that maybe is a development, but it's still a company based goal. So that for me is I think just changes the conversation, because now it's around, how are you developing that person over a longer period of time? And that might be a 3 year period, that might be a 5 year period, or it could be something faster. But now you're having a completely different conversation that's really focused on how you help that person develop as a person.
I think that's a great point. And really, what I hear you saying, the meta point is create a forum, right, where you're bringing maybe your team together and you're really there reinforcing the need for them to take ownership of their career and
Yeah.
create something that's not specifically related to like, oh, we need to ship this like next month,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And kind of reminds me, I actually did one of those at Microsoft. There was a manager, who was a leader there. He said, James, like, I want to create this forum and I want to do it by example. And, we did a couple sessions where there was 10 or so of his directs, and we actually had them create some of these artifacts, right, around some of their characteristics of where they are, as well as, and it could be really simple, taking out a sheet of paper, right, and a pencil. It doesn't have to be anything,
Yeah.
magical, and actually put some right some dots on pieces of paper and think about, right, in this roadmap, what are some of those destinations that, right,
Yeah.
that could be. And I find it opens the creativity when you're not constrained to what do I actually need to ship or what do I actually have to do tomorrow, and really think about some of those things, because those can also, right, as you said, it doesn't necessarily even have to be the next job, but it's likely going to reinforce what are some of the things I actually need to go do now, right, to overcome, right, the friction. Some of those friction are skills and knowledge, right? Um, Courses or experiences on the job, experiences that we need to demonstrate that we have those skills and competencies. The other thing, as we know, is we need to look at who are the actual people who are going to help influence that transition, right? The people who are potentially stakeholders in the decision, that could be a promotion, right? Are you invisible to them? Are there anything that you've done to really establish a relationship so that you are not this person who is unknown when it becomes time for, let's say, a new interesting opportunity or a
Yeah.
transfer or a promotion, right? There's all kinds of things to kind of raise that level of consciousness that you do have agency, you do have to be responsible, and it can be something that's so much fun to engage other people in. So thanks for sharing those things around kind of what you would do as a leader. And I hope some of those things are helpful to other people. Any kind of final thoughts for folks?
I mean, I think you kind of hit on where I would say is take control of your career. You do have agency, and take some time to think about where you want to go and what that job is that you want to do, and you build on that through spending some time on thinking about what's important, thinking about the things that you like to do and you're good at doing, and really kind of spending some time exploring. It doesn't happen overnight. So don't think about just, hey, I'm going to be able to spend, an hour doing this. It takes some time to kind of evolve and really think about this. If you could find a mentor that you can bounce some of these ideas off of, awesome, go do that as well. But really take control of your career, and really you do have to define what that is. And as you do that, you're going to be able to find people who help support you in getting there.
Yeah, no, thanks for leaving that as a really good reminder. To your point, a lot of people just go look for that next job, and they may not actually be very conscious of why that next job, right? And so doing some of the work around going inside, looking inside, getting calibrated around, right, your values and your interests and your, as you said, kind of purpose and where you are on that roadmap really, right, it really sharpens the lens as you then go out and look outward around, is there an opportunity in your current job to reshape it? Is there an opportunity inside the organization? Or maybe, it's an opportunity to go out and look elsewhere. So yeah, Ryan, really thanks for making time. If people want to find you, where's the best place to find you?
Best way is LinkedIn. So if you search for Ryan Reed JSR, we'll pop up to the top of your list. So feel free to reach out. It would be great to connect with people. But yeah, really appreciate the time, James. Love talking about this subject. For me, it's definitely been a big benefit, both from a career perspective, but also from a leadership perspective, about how I think about how I lead, but also impacting how others work through their careers and live their lives.
No, thanks. And I think, that just reminded me too of maybe one last point. If you're thinking about how else you can differentiate yourself as a leader, I think take these examples from what Ryan's done around taking a personal interest in people and developing them. Because in my experience, a lot of leaders either don't know how to do that, shy away from that, don't think it's as important of getting the wash out. And so I think really that could be something that could really make you very different inside your organization or kind of externally inside your peer group. So Ryan Reed, thanks for being with me, and I look forward to sharing this. I'll also include, as you mentioned, in the show notes, some things and some resources for people if they want to go inside and do a little bit of that introspection. I'll leave some kind of tools and references for you to go do that. And Ryan, appreciate you being a part of this podcast.
Yeah, thanks, James. Appreciate it. All right. It's been fun. Yeah.
Take care.